I'd like to explain how to make your buttons active on your screen, and they use things called an action listener, an action perform method, and an action command. So let's start by setting up the screen. So first off, what we're going to do is we'll start with the init method. And in the init method, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to resize my screen to one that will make my screen size more effective. Then I will add a title. I can mutate my title by using, in this case, I'm going to set the font to make it larger. Please notice that I have my declaration. I've declared it title, and then I've constructed it using the word new, JLabel, and then I've mutated it, and then I've added it to the screen. So next I'll add some buttons. And there's some new code that I'm going to add to the buttons, Action Command and Action Listener. These are what make your buttons active. So you need to simply pick a word here, and in the other bracket when you add Action Listener, you always put this. You never change it, it's always this. And then again down here, I'm going to pick a word to go in here. I'm going to pick opt2, and then I'm going to add Action Listener this, always this. So I've also mutated these buttons and changed their colors around. And then I'm going to have a label at the bottom of my screen which says nothing yet. So on this screen, it kind of explains Action Listeners a bit more. So Action Listeners are going to be watching over the buttons. They are a piece of code, and you set them up to have an action command, option 1 and option 2 in these cases, and they remember that action command to do something later on. So they just kind of keep watching on the button like while you're doing stuff. So let's actually set up the code so now we can start doing it. So one of the things we need to be aware of while we're getting started is something called a global variable. So when you're looking on this app and you see what is going to change on the screen, that is something that we need to make. We're going to move it to a new spot called global. So I hope you can see that at the bottom, it's going to start off saying nothing yet, and then it's going to end up saying false. All right, so that means that this bottom part here is going to need to become global. Let me talk about that further. So if there is a widget that is going to change, that means you need to set it up in Init, and then you need to change it in ActionPerformed. So that means it needs to be active in 2 methods. But variables can only be used in the method where they are declared. So if you put them inside a certain set of curly braces, that's the only spot you can use it. So if I was to put it in Init, I wouldn't be able to use it in ActionPerformed. They're different curly braces. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to move them up a set of brackets. So we're going to take them outside of the methods and put them just inside the class. And that will mean that I can use it in both Init and ActionPerformed. And that place in the code is called global. You should make a card for this. So the way that looks in the code is just under your public class line, we're going to do the declaration part. We're going to go JLabel output, and we're going to do that at the top. And then down in the code in the bottom, we take off the JLabel because that's the part that declares it, and we just construct it down there. So we're going to separate out these 2 sections to declare and construct. If you don't do this, your code will not be able to change anything on the screen. So it's very critical. Students forget this a lot. All right. So let's introduce 3 actions to you. So we've already looked at the action listeners a little bit, and they're the piece of code that we set up to watch our button. We're going to give them an action command. In this case, we've given it option 1. And when our button is pressed, the action listener's job is to call the ActionPerform method, tell it what the action command is, and then the ActionPerform method goes and does something. The action command is going to be a string. You can pick it to be whatever you want. I have to make them meaningful so that I can figure out what the heck's going on. They can have spaces, whatever. There's no restrictions whatsoever. And it's a word that the action listener passes to ActionPerformed so it can figure out which button was pressed. I kind of personally think of it as being like a code word, like activate code red or activate code chicken, whatever. And then the ActionPerformed says, code chicken. I know what to do when code chicken comes, and it goes and does the job. So then in ActionPerformed, that's a method, and that is what gets called when the button is pressed. And it has code that will respond to the user's click. This is where we're going to update the screen, change the labels, do exciting things. And in it takes the action command, like that code word that you gave it. So if you said code chicken, it's going to then go, oh, okay, what do I do for chicken? And then it'll go over and run that code. And that's what happens in ActionPerformed. So let's take a look at how this works with the app. I'll tell you a little story about this app. My dad was a kind of a turkey when he was going to school. And one day he went to school and he'd studied really hard for his exam, but he had a professor that he didn't like very much. And the professor always gave multiple choice exams. So my dad went into the exam and he had a coin on his desk, or possibly a dice. And for each question, what he did is he'd flip the coin, look at the coin, and then look at the question and fill it in. And then he flipped the coin again, he looked at the coin, and then he filled in his question. And he went down his whole exam doing this. He did it basically to irritate his professor because he wanted his professor to think that he guessed the whole way through the exam. But what he actually did is he actually knew the answers to all the questions. So he actually went through and filled them all in, truthfully. So he finished his exam really quickly, obviously, because he was making it look like he was guessing. And then he handed it in to the professor, and the professor was so angry he marked it right away, and he couldn't figure out how my dad got perfect when all he'd done is flip the coin. So that's what this app does. It allows you to flip the coin and get a true false answer for to bubble in on your test, or to get an A, B, C, D answer. I grant you it's not very useful. But anyways, so in the beginning, in Init, we had set up our two action listeners. And this action listener is watching over this button, and this action listener is watching over this button. And this one's action command is opt1, and this one's opt2. So ActionPerformed is hanging out doing nothing at the beginning. She's got nothing to do. She's just reading her book. So then our user comes along and they press the first button. So what happens is the action listener is activated, and the action listener then calls to the action performed, and it says, hey, I've been clicked, you need to do something. And that's kind of happens in this first line. It gets called. E, who's hanging out kind of here in the code, E says, oh, what's the action command? And the action listener says it's opt1. So then E knows the action command, and E is called upon during the code to give that information back. So then we start running through our program, and the ActionPerformed method starts running the code. So the first thing is it asks, what is the action command? Well, E tells us that it's opt1. So then the ActionPerformed method knows that it needs to run this code right here. So it goes in and it has a random number between 1 and 2, and then it will change the code on the screen to update to say that it needs to be false or true, depending on what the code runs. And that's how that works. So our action listener summons the action performed method, it passes in the action command, and then they use the action command opt1 to determine which section of code gets run. All right, let's try another example. So we're sitting here, we've got our two action listeners, we've got our two action commands, opt1, opt2. Action performs doing nothing. She's waiting around. Now our user's going to click the other button. Good times. All right, so then the other action listener summons action performed. And E asks, what's the action command? So it tells it that it is opt2. So then E knows that they're going to need to go and run the opt2 code. So it would start off by taking a look at the action command here, seeing it was an opt1, and then it knows that we're going to need to run opt2's code. So then the action perform method goes through this program, it chooses the random number, it sets the color to be blue, you can see it's blue, and it then updates the screen accordingly. You can also notice in this code some other things. You can see how we're changing the color with set foreground, and you can see how we're changing the text with set text. And that is the basics of the action command, action listener, and action perform method. Good luck on your sheet.